Hello and welcome to Debate at right here at PressTV. I'm Marcia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Politicizing humanitarianism seems to be more and more the way of the world. Nowhere is this more evident than in Syria. For 5 years, the Syrian people and government have been fighting terrorists who have come from around the world. And there was no call for investigating war crimes committed by terrorists against the Syrian people, even though crimes such as beheadings, using people as human shields, raping and the torture of civilians have taken place. It appears the United Nations did not deem these crimes worthy of being looked into as possible war crimes. When will the situation in Syria really be looked at from a humanitarian perspective and in the suffering of the Syrian people?
Shattering calm has blanketed the Syrian city of Aleppo, the scene of bombardments and fierce fighting between government forces and foreign-backed militants over the past few weeks. This is part of humanitarian lull declared by the Syrian and Russian militaries since Thursday. It aims to provide a safe passage for both the civilians in the eastern part of the city and the militants willing to leave. But reports indicate not too many civilians have left Aleppo, and the injured are still stranded.
We have been waiting since 6 o'clock in the morning in Castle Low Road and wait for our brothers to medically help them. We wish they come out safe and sound.
As the UN Office for Humanitarian Affairs blames the security situation for the delay, the Syrian and Russian authorities accuse the militants of using ordinary people as human shields.
They say security conditions prevent that. While we know and they know that this is not the reason, that they are prevented by different terrorists inside the city from the evacuation, but I don't know why they don't want to talk about that.
Aleppo's lull comes in the wake of the collapse of a previous truce in September. At the time, Moscow blamed Washington for being unwilling to differentiate between so-called moderate and extremist militants. On Friday, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution calling for an investigation into alleged war crimes perpetrated by Russia and Syria in Aleppo.
This council has been called to discuss the disgraceful human rights crisis in Syria, the violations and abuses suffered by the people across the country, including the siege and bombardment of eastern Aleppo, are not simply tragedies, they also constitute crimes of historic proportions.
Experts doubt if the West is genuinely concerned about rights violations in Aleppo.
The indications are that it is politics that may be driving the Human Rights Council resolution rather than a concern for war crimes. And the reason is that the sponsor of the resolution is the UK. Animus toward Russia and its desire to protect the main terrorist group in Aleppo, which in fact is holding the civilians hostage.
Russia and Syria have both strongly condemned the UN resolution as pathetic and say they will continue their humanitarian efforts. Moscow also says it aims to liberate Syria from the extremist militants, and to that end, it will do everything to prevent the partition of the country, a scenario which could lead to the most catastrophic results for the whole region.
I'd like to welcome my guests to this debate out of San Francisco, Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, and out of Washington, D.C., Mr. Richard Hellman, president of Middle East Research Center. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in D.C. And Mr. Hellman, why is it that the lives of civilians in eastern Aleppo is getting so much more attention than those in western Aleppo, where people have been suffering too and are targeted by snipers, mortars, and the possibility of being attacked on a daily basis?
I'm not sure that that really is the case. The main thing is that there has been a ceasefire for which we all must thank God, some at least brief respite from the vicious and terrible killing and destruction which Syria has been subject to. My best sources tell me that there's upwards of 500,000 500,000 Syrians dead in the last 5.5 years. 15 million Syrians driven to become refugees. It is past time for the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain have the Security Council unanimously decide that there must be a permanent ceasefire and intervention by the United Nations security forces to have new elections and a new democracy, and let the people choose freely who they want to govern Syria. But the main thing is not just a ceasefire, but to have the great powers of the world who are involved on various sides here to say, stop the killing. Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Council indeed has taken a good step to start to identify the brutal killings and barrel bombings and other things that have happened with respect to the Syrian people, in which the Damascus regime, egged on by Russia and also by Iran, we should say. The Ayatollahs and President Rouhani of Iran support Bashar al-Assad in the butchery that has taken place of the Syrian people. Not all have been killed by the Damascus regime, but the majority have been killed by those forces.
Stay with me, Mr. Hellman. Let me get Mr. Bennett in on this discussion. Mr. Bennett, you've heard our guest out of Washington. Interestingly enough, in all of this, he seems actually to be repeating the same line that comes officially out of Washington. Very little, in his case, nothing was said about Daesh, about the terrorist groups, about al-Nusra, about these entities who have been wreaking havoc in Syria for 5 years, but all the fingers are pointing at the Syrian government, Russia, and of course Iran. Your take, sir.
Well, I was an Army officer. I worked at the State Department. I worked at Special Operations Command. I worked at U.S. Central Command. Your other guests did not. And I can tell you unequivocally, and I never discuss anything classified, but I can tell you from the Iraq situation, in my experience, the problem was always foreign fighters. I remember Iraqi commanders throwing down buckets of foreign fighter passports. And the same thing applies to Mosul, the same thing applies to Aleppo. This is an invasion by foreign fighters, and it's an invasion by foreign fighters because they're financed by Kuwait, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and that's allowed and facilitated by the Hillary Clinton State Department and her partners Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer at the Department of Justice, and law firms like Covington and Burling that represents UBS, HSBC, and big banks. And we reported all that information in Shell Game, and it contains all of the WikiLeaks cables. We sent it to Congress, we sent it to the members of the military, and no one did anything. Now, in full disclosure, we are filing a lawsuit against the Hillary Clinton Foundation, Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, for denying the United States military this vital terrorist financing information that's now coming out with WikiLeaks. So what we see with WikiLeaks, and thank God for Julian Assange, we see all the bank accounts and all the collaboration and conspiracy between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, giving money to Bill Clinton, giving money to the Clinton Foundation in exchange for arms and signatures for arms going to these countries. They went to Libya, they caused Benghazi, they then funneled the money up to Turkey, they funneled the weapons to Turkey, Qatar and Saudi played a big part of that, and then they're sending them to the foreign fighters that have infiltrated their way into Aleppo. This is not about President Assad barrel bombing his own people. That is a lie. That is a false narrative. This is about the duly elected Democrat president of Syria protecting his people from foreign fighters, foreign invaders who have no love for the people. That's why they're using them as human shields.
Okay.
And thank God for Vladimir Putin being on the United Nations Security Council, because at last we will have Russia, Iran, China set up a corridor between Syria and Baghdad that will push these foreign fighters out of Syria and Iraq. And the United States had better get on board, and that's why Donald Trump will step in and ally with Russia, China, and Iran against the Saudi Wahhabi terrorist foreign fighters that are a cause of all this.
Okay.
And Israel
Stay with me,
and the
Mr. Bennett.
Zionist elements that provide them for medical treatment are at blame too.
All right, stay with me. Turning back to Mr. Hellman. Mr. Hellman, how do you see? You heard some of the comments by Mr. Bennett. Is it not curious for you as an American that your country is allied with the entities such as Saudi Arabia, which has a horrendous human rights record, and of course support the Wahhabis, the Salafis, that make up the majority of the terrorists? But we have not heard you condemn that side of things. Your take on that? How much do you see your country being responsible for what is happening in Syria?
Well, in light of what Mr. Bennett said from San Francisco, I too was an Army officer, and so I understand something about military matters and intelligence and security, and I don't think this should devolve into a diatribe about the U.S. politics and the U.S. elections. There's enough blame to go around there, but I would agree that the United States must do much more to say to the Arab states as well as to Iran that you must desist from your persecution of your own people. You must allow free speech. You must allow freedom of religion. But let's get back to Aleppo.
Yes, let's get back to Aleppo because the question, sir, let's get back to Syria itself. Mr. Hellman, the question was related. Mr. Hellman, the question was related to Saudi Arabia, who is involved in Syria. So that was the question. Go ahead.
Yes, and I said that yes, the Saudis, the Qataris, and so forth must get more pressure from the United States to liberalize in proper ways to have free democratic government as Tehran should have.
Sir, we're not talking about what Saudi Arabia is doing in its own country right now. We're talking about its support for terrorism inside of Syria.
One moment. One moment. I'm telling you that I agree that ISIS and the other terrorist groups, as well as Hezbollah, that is allied with Tehran, which is supported by Tehran, which is a cat's paw of Tehran, and Bashar al-Assad, the butcher of Damascus, who is supported by Tehran and Russia. All of these powers must be brought together by the Security Council, and as Jimmy Carter said, there should be a Security Council resolution that under Article 7 that calls for an end to this war and puts appropriate forces in there to make peace and keep peace. And yes, I know that, and I can say in good conscience that Russia and China would probably feel that they were double-crossed with respect to Libya. But I would beseech them to give the United States government another chance and to side in with the other members of the Security Council to stop the killing in Syria. There's enough blame to go around. Yes, ISIS, yes, all these other terrorist groups and Hezbollah and the government of Damascus are killing Syrians. The killing must stop.
No, the blame goes to Hillary Clinton and the State Department.
All the faith. I think you give them too much credit. But
all right, stay with me, Mr. Hellman. Stay with me, sir. Let me get Mr. Bennett. Go ahead, Mr. Bennett.
Wait a second. I think one moment.
Wait a minute. You've had your time. You've had your time. No,
I'm giving each of you appropriate time. Mr. Hellman, I've given you a couple of minutes. Going back now to San Francisco. Go ahead.
Thank you. We're tired of all this diatribe and emotionism and propaganda. You're dealing with a guy who did propaganda and psychological warfare, so don't go on a tale about talk. Let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the money. Let's talk about the foreign fighters. All the money, all the foreign fighters came from the Hillary Clinton State Department. I saw that. I worked in that area. And all the money and all the funds and the weapons went up from the CIA and went up from Benghazi, went up into Turkey. It did it through Qatar. It did it through Saudi Arabia. It did it through Kuwait. It was funneled up. It was sent into Syria and Aleppo. Bashar Assad is a democratically elected president. The United States has no right to go in and try and remove him, nor does it have a right to go in and remove anybody in Iran or Iraq or Russia or any other country. We are not the policemen, and men like I who have served in this war are offended by those disgusting parasites who push people like us into war for Israel's benefit to destabilize the rest of the world around it. Europe is waking up to that. The Philippines has woken up to that. China has woken up to that. Russia has woken up to that. And they are all taking action to shut down these wars.
All right,
That's why Donald Trump is winning. He is stopping this fanaticism.
Mr. Hellman, is the main problem that some of these Western countries are having with eastern Aleppo more due to the effectiveness of Russia and the Syrians in the city, and that Western-supported terrorists are actually losing ground?
Of course they are. I think that begs the question. It's not about which terrorist groups are winning and which terrorist groups are losing. The killing must stop, and the Western powers have been clear about that, if nothing else. And yes, foreign fighters,
the Western powers have been financing them.
Stopped from. Wait a second. That's enough. I'm going to tell you that this has nothing to do with Israel, which is the only free country with respect for the rights of all citizens.
They're providing medical aid and support to the Wahhabi Takfiri terrorists.
No, you're wrong. Christians. Wait, no, stop it. I
was there. I saw.
Okay, stay with me, Mr. Bennett. Go ahead, Mr. Hellman.
Christians, Jews, and Muslims all have the equal rights in Israel. It's the only place in the Middle East where they all can speak out freely. And Israel has no part in the Syrian war except to see the killing stopped and to see Syria become a quiet, peaceful country with a truly elected democratic government.
Okay, well, going back to Mr. Bennett.
That's none of Israel's business.
Mr. Bennett.
Well, Israel has no right to step into the Golan Heights. It has no right to provide medical help to the Wahhabi Takfiris that are raping women and beheading little boys. And American politicians, I have to say, like Senator Dick Black, like Tulsi Gabbard out of Hawaii, Dick Black out of Virginia, those former military politicians are saying that Bashar Assad needs to stay, and that we should be aligned with Russia, we should be aligned with Assad, we should be aligned with Iran, we should be aligned with China in battling the scourge of Wahhabi terrorism that is the source of raping women like Yazidi women and slave bazaars and killing and beheading people with no scruples. They're not Islamic. They don't represent the teachings of Muhammad, peace be upon him. They represent everything corrupt and evil, and they are being pushed and trained by both the Israel Zionist camp and the Saudi Arabian Wahhabi camp. And the U.S. is just as guilty because we have abandoned Europe to the infiltration, one, by legitimate migration of people that have no more homes, but then the terrorists are riding on their backs, going up and destabilizing Germany, France, Sweden. France is overwhelmed, and they are waking up to say, are we going to stop this or are we going to continue it? And the way to stop it is for Russia to have its air force in Syria and Baghdad, so that it shows the United States, hey, if you want to destroy the enemy, let's work together. Right. If you don't, then we will destroy the enemy.
All right, Mr. Hellman, because you did comment, of course, about Israel being the most democratic country in the region. Of course, I'm sure the Palestinians who have to go through checkpoints every day would just really beg to differ. But anyway, when we're looking at the UN General Assembly and Human Rights Council, it's calling for an investigation of possible war crimes in eastern Aleppo. What do you think about the timing of this call for an investigation? And is it telling at all that Saudi Arabia, who's supporting the terrorists, is one of the members of the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, I think the UN Human Rights Council should have an open investigation of all the parties in Syria, because there is enough blame to go around and there's enough blood on many of the hands, and I think there's even blood on my Islamic friend in San Francisco, Mr. Bennett, who wants to side in with one side against the other.
I'm a Christian, pal. Get your religious facts straight. I'm a Christian.
The UN Security Council must intervene and do what only the UN can do, with powerful support from all the great powers working together to stop the killing in Syria after 5.5 years.
Yeah, and look what they did to Benghazi, Libya, when the United Nations stepped in. The United Nations set up a no-fly zone and destroyed Libya and sent everybody into Europe. You're saying exactly that. You're prescribing the exact same solution that happened in Libya in Syria.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Hellman. Go ahead.
It's a same template.
Let Mr. Hellman finish his comments. Go ahead, Mr. Hellman.
That's a different program. As I said earlier, President Obama and Hillary Clinton, with the help of their advisors at the UN and in the White House, went into Libya in a half-baked way. It was not the Security Council acting in unity.
Okay, as you said, it's a different show, and I'm running out of time. Another program on Libya right now. Going back to Mr. Bennett, San Francisco.
I agree.
Stay with me, Mr. Hellman. Mr. Bennett, no, because I'm running out of time, sir. In the middle, back to San Francisco. In the middle, Mr. Bennett, of this suffering taking place in Syria, the United States is still saying that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad must go. It seems that number one priority for the Americans is not Daesh, but President Assad. Does this indict the U.S. in supporting terrorists from the beginning?
Is not elected in new free elections.
Mr. Hellman, Mr. Hellman,
elected in new free elections.
Have respect.
He should go.
Have respect. Mr. Bennett, my question to you was, looking at all of this, and the U.S. continually says that the goal is to overthrow Assad. Even now, with the situation, it has never really been Daesh, and talking about Daesh as being their main priority. In this case, isn't it the United States which should be charged with war crimes, because it seems that they have implicated themselves, that the priority really is not the terrorist group, but the rightly elected government in Syria? How do you see it, sir?
Please.
Well, you have every piece of evidence that indicates a Nuremberg trial, and if your other guest would shut his mouth and listen to the truth, maybe the rest of the people will be educated on the facts, and that is a Nuremberg trial is required to hold into justice Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, the American political figures like Dick Cheney and George Bush that opened the door for this. But if we look specifically at Libya, that disaster, that fiasco, was facilitated by Hillary Clinton and the State Department. It's being furthered by John Kerry in Syria. They have no interest in any human rights. They have no interest in any democracy.
Said this is not about Libya.
They have interested in destabilizing Russia, destabilizing Iran, and then that's going to cause destabilization in Europe.
Okay, and on that note, unfortunately,
I'm not interested in what you think it's for. We all know what you stand for. We know what country you serve.
Excuse me, we're out of time. I have to thank both of you. And unfortunately, we did not have the respect that was required for this program, Mr. Hellman. Mr. Scott Bennett, thank you so much for being with us out of San Francisco. And Mr. Richard Hellman out of Washington, thanks so much for being with us. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi signing out for myself and other crew right here in Tehran. Thanks so much and goodbye.